Welcome to the Culture, Faith, and Politics podcast. I'm Pat Kahnke, and I'm joined today by Charlie Sykes. And hi, Charlie. It's
Hey,
really
good
good to
morning.
have
How are
you.
you? Thank you.
Good, good. Before I fully introduce you, I actually wanted to start with something a little bit lighter. Just the elephant in the room is I'm over here in St. Paul. You're right next door in
Right.
Wisconsin. Yeah, and things have been kind of dark in the world lately, but in Minnesota, we had a real reprieve this week in that the entire state of Minnesota got a huge win because the Vikings announced that they're not going to be pursuing your guy, Aaron Rodgers. And I just wanted to know, do you agree with my assessment that Green Bay fans are sort of like the lucky Tesla owners who bought the car, enjoyed it,
Right.
and then sold it before the face of the company went crazy?
Yeah, no, we apparently got the showroom model of Aaron Rodgers, and everybody else got the sort of the crazy knockoff.
Right, exactly. Yeah, so good for you. And we dodged a bullet on that one, I think. So,
You did.
yeah. So as I mentioned, Charlie's based in Wisconsin, and he comes from a journalism background originally, and for many years he was the top-rated, top-rated, highly respected conservative talk show host. But he gave all that away during the 2016 election when he looked at Donald Trump and he said, "Yeah, no, I'm not doing that." So he pretty much got excommunicated, I think, from the conservative movement at that point, and which I can relate to, except on a much lower level. And in 2018, he wrote the book "How the Right Lost Its Mind," and I'll provide a link to that book in the show notes. But Charlie, I started listening to your daily podcast in 2019, shortly after you started the Bulwark, and I just got to tell you that those daily conversations that you had really they helped me to understand what was going on. They helped me to get perspective, and those conversations, I think, were a bigger influence on me during those years than almost anything else that I listened to
Really?
or read. Yeah, so
Well,
I just
thank
really
you.
want to thank you for that. So it's a big deal that I'm able to talk to you here now. In 2024, Charlie stepped away from the daily grind of doing that podcast and the daily writing of the newsletter for a time.
Hmm.
But you continued to appear on MSNBC as a political analyst and to do some more writing. But now I'm excited Charlie's back to producing a regular podcast called To the Contrary. And I've been really enjoying that again. And so I just encourage people to read his daily newsletter on Substack at To the Contrary, and or to listen to him on YouTube or wherever you find your
Thank you.
podcasts. So yeah. So before I say anything else, Charlie, I just want to do something for you that you've been doing for me for years. I don't think that any of us can hear this enough. So Charlie Sykes, you are not the crazy one.
Thank you. Thank you. We, we,
Yeah.
we do need to hear that. Every single day we need to hear that.
Right, right. So I gave a thumbnail of your background, but I want to let you just go here for a minute because on your background, basically, because one of the main reasons that I'm doing this podcast and my YouTube channel is that I want to help people to rise above tribalism. I want to help
Right.
people to get past, I want to help people to put their principles ahead of their tribal affiliations. And so whether that's a political party or a particular religious sect or whatever. So I think it's just valuable whenever I can share someone's story who's done exactly that at great cost. And I think it's inspiring. I think a lot of our listeners won't know your story. So please just, if you could, just share that to get us started as much as you'd like to share in that.
Well, thank you very much, and I like the way that you've cast this because it is easy to get caught up in tribalism. It is easy to get caught up in an information bubble, and and it's hard to step away. I think a lot of politics has become about identity rather than ideas, and so it is important to kind of remember who we are and what our principles are, because it is in the rush of the news cycle and of the partisanship, sort of easy to get swept up with the crowd and hate the right people and like the right people. And after a while you realize, why am I, spouting all of these cliches? Have I really thought them through? But it is difficult to break away. I mean, it is difficult to break away from the tribe. And one of the things that I encountered when I was working on my book, How the Right Lost Its Mind, was the insight from social psychologists that, we all think of our minds as things that we use to determine what is true, right? That we use reason to determine what is right. When in fact, the way we're wired is to use our reasoning and our minds to strengthen our bonds to our tribes. And so you can understand why so many people engaged in motivated reasoning, believing things that will attach them to the tribe, and are so reluctant to believe or to say something that could isolate you. And I do think this point of isolation is crucial. And I'm going to get to your question in a moment, but why what you're doing and what I try to do, I think is valuable, because there is this tendency for people to think, am I completely alone? Am I the only one who's looking at this and thinking this is wrong, or this is crazy, or this is nuts? And so, and especially, after COVID, I think that people did become separated from one another and desperately need to have contact with people who will share their values or share their doubts. So you asked me my background, and I'm going to make it somewhat short. I come from a family of journalists. My father was, I've described him as a contrarian and a curmudgeon, which I admired greatly. He was at one time I would say a liberal activist. He was the campaign manager for Eugene McCarthy, who was the anti-Vietnam War candidate back in 1968. And I was in 8th grade back then, and I traveled around. I got involved in politics, became, marginally involved in as politics as a kid. But later in life, began to question some of those verities. And so I guess part of it is that, being an only child, I have been more willing to go my own way. So I described myself for many years as a recovering liberal, that I grew up in a liberal Democratic household. But after I got my first job in journalism, I began to look around and saying, okay, do these policies work? Are they actually accomplishing what they do? And then when I would raise those questions, people would say, well, what's wrong with you? Are you a conservative? And because I don't mind being a contrarian, I said, I don't care what you call me. These programs do not work. And I'm prepared to challenge these orthodoxies. So I found myself drifting into what at that time would have been called conservative politics, which is very different than now. So, I grew up reading books by George Will and William F. Buckley and Charles Krauthammer, and was very attracted to them because in the late 1970s and 80s, believe it or not, it was conservatives who were writing the most interesting and provocative things. And so I had developed a real appreciation for their critiques and their values. And so I thought I understood what it meant to be a conservative. Perhaps mistaking the intellectual conservative, mode for being what the actual movement was. So I was in journalism for some time, edited a magazine, and then went into talk radio, which I enjoyed, because at the same time that I was on, had a conservative talk shows, I was writing books. I wrote books about higher education, about our culture of victimization. And what I liked about it was different ways of expressing ideas. When you write, you think in a different way, but I also think that it's important to be able to communicate clearly and directly with people. So I regarded it as a conversation. And for 23 years, I engaged in that conversation with some very savvy people in Wisconsin. Voters in Wisconsin, like in Minnesota, are locked in. They're thoughtful. We dealt with some major issues. And I thought we had a pretty good bond with one another. Radio is different than other media because you're in people's heads.
Right.
People have a relationship with you. It's not like reading something or even seeing something on a screen. You develop this relationship. And for 23 years, I had a pretty good relationship with the audience, and I think we understood one another. And then along came Donald Trump, who represented everything that I thought was cartoonish about right-wing politics.
Mm.
And I actually believe things like character matters. So to make a long story short, I was not buying what Donald Trump was selling. My audience wasn't either. And you might recall back in 2016, Donald Trump did not win the Republican primary in Wisconsin.
Right.
Because I think people saw through all that. But one after another, as we know, Republicans decided that they were going to compromise. They were going to either make a Faustian bargain with Donald Trump, or they decided that this is what they actually believed in. Now, you said that I stepped away from my radio show, which I did, which was voluntary, but I don't know that I could have survived in conservative media in the era of Trump. And I knew that I was going to be excommunicated. I knew that I was stepping off into a small desert island. I had no idea it was going to be as small or as deserty as it turned out to be. And so when I wrote my book, How the Right Lost Its Mind in 2017, I still actually believe that at some point, Republicans were going to come back to their senses. They were going to come back to the party that used to believe in, free people, American exceptionalism, that believed in many of these values. But it turned out that I had understated, I think, the threat. So that's the short version of it. So I find myself in a position of having once thought I understood what conservatism was, watched its transmogrification into Trumpism. I can still recognize many of the things that I hear, but remember those old Bizarro comics where you'd have like Superman and then you have Bizarro Superman, where it's like you kind of recognize it, but it's taken on this completely different hue. So I find myself straddling multiple worlds.
Yeah. I can relate to that, and I appreciate it. For myself, I was really involved in politics before I went into ministry. For people who don't know, I was a pastor for 20 years, evangelical pastor. Before I went into ministry, I was super involved in like the pro-life movement, and then I put all of that aside when I went into ministry, and I actually made a conscious choice because I was noticing that I was sort of judging some of the people in my churches who disagreed with me politically.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, that's not right. So I actually made a conscious choice to just shut off all political from taking in any political content for almost 20 years. So I went from being a guy who voted for Reagan in 1984, the first time I voted, and was involved in the pro-life movement, to basically apolitical, but I was still voting Republican the whole time. As a pastor, I just never talked about it or read about it. So in 2016, when I retired, it was like I dipped my toe back in, and I started by watching Fox News because that's what I had been watching. And but even watching Fox News, it was still like, no, not this guy. We're not going to do this, are we?
Yeah, we're not going to do this.
Yeah, and turns out we are. And I think the hardest lesson for me, one of the hardest lessons, is what you just said, where we're not going back. I think for a long time I thought we're going to be someday we're just going to say, oh, this was dumb. This was a fever dream.
Right.
And we're going to wake up from that. But I think probably I learned it later than you did, that we're not going back. And one of my big questions is, we'll get into some other things here, but as long as we're on this topic, what do you even see as going forward? Like what would be a few of the principles, like if the Republican Party at this point were to kind of wake up from the fever dream? I don't think it should go back to exactly what it was.
No.
What would be a few principles that you would say these are the things that they ought to build around if they want to be a helpful party in moving the country forward.
Well, first of all, I mean, let's just go back a bit. That we're not alone in not expecting that it was going to become as extreme as it was. I mean, I was very, very good friends with Paul Ryan, very, very good friends with Reince Priebus before he became Donald Trump's chief of staff. And, these were people who were always, saying, well, okay, first of all, he's not going to win. This is not going to happen. Okay, but we can handle him. That there was still a core of the party that believed in free markets, that actually believed in human dignity. You mentioned the pro-life movement. For more than 15 years, I was the master of ceremonies at the Wisconsin Right to Life dinner up until 2016, when I knew that I was moving on, but I agreed to do one last dinner because George Will was going to be the speaker, and I've had a very strong relationship with George Will. I really admire George Will. Week before the dinner, they called up and said we've canceled Will because of something he wrote, and we've replaced him with Tucker Carlson. Which, by the way, seems symbolic at the time. And the reason I'm bringing that up is because I am pro-life. I have been pro-life, but then you're watching how the Republican, the right wing, embraces anti-life ideology in every other part of it. The embracing the cruelty and the brutality. And so one of the benefits of being excommunicated is there's a sense of liberation to begin to think about it and to say, okay, why am I pro-life? And what are those values? What do they mean? And how do I reconcile this with this new cruelty and this lack of concern for human life? And I understand that many people think, if you think of politics as tribal, you just go along with everything. It's like it's like a buffet where you have to eat everything from it. And I think that one of the benefits of being independent is you step back and you go, well, no, I'm not going to buy that. I don't think that's consistent. I don't think that's consistent with Christian values. My understanding of what Christianity is about and what we owe one another is completely different from this. And I thought that conservatives believe that. I thought that the essence of conservatism was we were compassionate. We did care about individuals. We did not look to the state or the government. We did not look to the collective. We looked to one another as individuals. Well, that's been completely destroyed. So the speed with which this has happened has taken everybody by surprise. So when you ask the question, what has to happen? Right now, I'll be honest with you. I don't know what the future holds. I don't think anyone knows what the future holds.
Right.
The radicalization of the right is continuing at such an aggressive pace that it's hard to see how it comes back. I've been affiliated with groups like Principles First, which has a long list of really solid principles about freedom, individual dignity, the rule of law, all of which seem now to be completely alien to what you're seeing. Right. So, where do you start with this question? How about actually returning to something that we assumed all conservatives understood and appreciated, which is the rule of law and the importance of our constitutional system, including the separation of powers, going back to think and the rule of law being the fundamental conservative value that the government was restricted from doing certain things, that we had these inalienable rights. And I think that that's kind of crucial, especially as we see this sort of aggressive use of government power to intimidate and bully. You and I should not, if we do not break the law, we should not be afraid of our government. Right. To see universities, big law firms, the media being afraid of government, feeling that they need to bend the knee to government, that's not the American system. I recognize that from history. I recognize that from authoritarian regimes, but there's something deeply wrong about it. If I sit here for one moment and I think I shouldn't write this or I shouldn't say this because I will make the government angry at me, whoa, I am now living in a different country. Right. So I would hope that conservatives would get back to that, as well as some sense of, why we were in favor of individual liberty, but also that individual liberty cannot be separated from character. The thing that has, again, I'm exploding my mind. Do you remember back in the 1990s when all conservatives said character counts, character matters? And of course it did. And yet the rejection of the notion of character and virtue and just decency with one another. These are these fundamental, non-political conservative values, what it meant to be a Christian. I keep thinking, what would happen if you went to a MAGA meeting, a Charlie Kirk event, and you read the Sermon on the Mount to them? They would boo you. They would think you were being woke. So something has broken fundamentally. And if I knew how to fix it, I would be doing something different than what we're doing right now, but I don't know how to fix it.
Right. Yeah. I can relate to this. Like I get asked a lot, like there's a pretty active conversation going on my YouTube channel under the videos, that's actually a good conversation. People sometimes make fun of the comments on YouTube videos, but man,
Yes,
I'm actually impressed with the passion that people bring to this. And I've got quite a mix of people listening. I've got, it's called Culture, Faith, and Politics. And so I am talking about, more politics than anything, unfortunately, but that intersection of faith and politics. And one of the things that I get accused of with some regularity is, well, you were a conservative, you were part of this whole thing, and it's like, and they'll say things like, it was always about race, it was always about control, it was always about, and I think it never was for me, but yet I feel like we're almost proving, not us, but I mean the former party that I belong to is almost proving these things right. And I think, was it all a lie? Was I just taken in?
That's the Stuart Stevens book, that was all a lie. This is an interesting question, and I get the same sort of thing. Like, Charlie, you built this, you contributed to this. How did you not see this? And I recognize the truth in this, but also I do think it's important to say, look, what we are seeing now is not a continuation of it. It is a radical break. You could not imagine Ronald Reagan voting in the United Nations with Russia. You could not imagine, many of the people who are, what would you call establishment Republicans, even very prominent conservatives, going along with the attack on the Constitution. During Watergate, it was conservative Republicans who were the ones who drew the line and said Richard Nixon needs to go. It was Barry Goldwater who led that delegation. But to the point, look, there's always been this nativist, racist stream in American culture. There's always been an isolationist, American first stream in American culture, going back to George Wallace and Father Coughlin and to the American Firsters. And I've always been aware of them, but I always thought that they were a recessive gene in American conservatism, that they were never the dominant force, that you always knew that there would be some nut job who would rise up, but ultimately it was going to be reasonable people. It would be the John McCains, it would be the Mitt Romneys, it would be the Paul Ryans, even the Bushes, that the center would hold. So you kind of knew, and I overuse this analogy, that this is like the drunk at the end of the bar, that is yelling. And maybe you think, okay, I'm not going to kick him out of my bar because he's on my softball team, but he's never going to dominate. Or your crazy uncle at Thanksgiving, where everybody's, hey, just pass Uncle, Uncle Otto, and some more stuffing. But what happened was that the center did not hold. And so these people that you always knew were there, have taken control. But the conservative movement that I was part of, starting in the late 1980s, was very reformist. It was people like Jack Kemp, and at that time, Bill Bennett. And they were thoughtful and they were serious. If you read the works of Charles Krauthammer, trust me, you are not going to be able to draw a direct line from Charles Krauthammer to Steve Bannon. You're not going to be able to go from George Will or Edmund Burke to Ann Coulter or to Tucker Carlson. there is a break. And I think that people on the left sometimes make the mistake because you need to understand. And on the one hand, they say this is not normal. This is an existential threat. But when you say it's not normal, you are acknowledging that this is not the way politics used to be. We used to argue about uniforms in schools and tax rates and a variety of other things and our disagreements about foreign policy, but nothing as fundamental as this. So no, there is a Father Coughlin and George Wallace are a tradition, but they were always a minority tradition. Unfortunately, now they've become mainstream. One other point, it is a crucial moment in the history of modern conservatism that William F. Buckley Jr., who was the founder of the modern conservative movement, understood in the early 1960s that you had to have guardrails, that you had to have umpires, that you had to get rid of, quite frankly, the mouth breathers, the John Birch Society folks, the Ku Klux Klan, the anti-Semites. And so there was a real effort, that if you were a racist, if you were a John Bircher, if you were an anti-Semite, that you were not welcome in the conservative movement. The problem is all those guardrails broke down, and now there is no restriction, and they are flooding the zone. This is not what you and I thought the conservative movement was. I thought it was the dam against that sort of thing. Now here we are.
Exactly. Yeah. Thank you. And you use the phrase "not normal," and what's one of the disheartening things for me is quite often when I tell people this is not normal, they say exactly, and that's why I'm like it. It's like and I think it represents like a fundamental misunderstanding of. I think people take for granted the guardrails. They take for granted the system. It's like it's one thing to want to reform the system. It's one thing to be frustrated. And I go back to Ronald Reagan talking about, I remember, because this is when I was voting for him, talking about the most frightening words in the English language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help you." And so there's like this, I think there's this obvious good to want to reform things, but this is not reformation that we're seeing. And I feel like a lot of what's happening is going on the history of reform that's been put out there that is not. This is not what it's a break from it. So I want to talk about your. Yeah, go ahead.
No, and what I've done in the past, I was on a panel, like I think it was about 7 or 8 years ago, with somebody was talking about that Trump was a continuation of Reagan, and I remember I wanted to read to him this from Ronald Reagan's final speech, where he talked about. Try to imagine these words coming out of Donald Trump's mouth. This is Ronald Reagan's final speech. "I've spoken of the shining city all my political life, but I don't know if I ever quite communicated what I saw when I said it. But in my mind, it was a tall, proud city built on rocks stronger than oceans, windswept, God-blessed, and teeming with people of all kinds living in harmony and peace. A city with free ports that hummed with commerce and creativity. And if there had to be city walls, the walls had doors, and the doors were open to anyone with the will and the heart to get here. That is how I saw it, and I see it still." Can you imagine Donald Trump saying anything remotely like that?
Yeah, it's unbelievable. And I think about your friend Paul Ryan, and one of the most disheartening conversations that I listened to, because I still remember where I was. I was walking in the neighborhood. This was during the primaries when you were talking with Paul Ryan. You did like a public interview, and I was listening to it. I was walking up to Stogie's to buy some cigars. I remember everything about it because I was so kind of enraged by this interview, in that he was saying, like, you were asking him to basically just, why don't you just come out and just go full on against, like the wrongness of Trump in many ways. And his strategy was just to say, no, he's not electable. He's not electable. That's the point I'm making. And you were warning him. You were saying, but he's going to become, your candidate if you don't take him on. And he had nothing for that except to say, no, I'm just making the case that he's not electable. and rather than make a moral case, rather than make a principled case.
This.
And it was so here I'm just a guy in St. Paul listening to this conversation and thinking Charlie's being really patient here. And I just what in the end he said, well, if that happens, if he becomes the nominee, then I'll deal with it. Then we'll make that, then we'll make this other case. And I thought, no, he's not gonna. Not in any
way. He didn't.
And he's just representative. Vote. That's all. I'm not ripping on him, but he's representative.
When I first wrote the book, I think I know it's become a cliche now. Hold on a second here. We can, I know it's become a cliche to quote Yeats, the best lack all conviction while the worst are full of passionate intensity.
I just wrote that down here.
Yeah. Oh, okay. I
wrote that down when you quoted it earlier about the center does not hold. That's where I was going next.
Well, it's the same poem, and I was thinking about Paul. I thought he was the future of the party, and yet when it came to it, he wouldn't draw the line, and he made that calculation. In many ways, he represents what happened, look, I know how he felt about Donald Trump. We didn't disagree about it whatsoever. When he refused to endorse Donald Trump the first time around, they called me and they said, you're going to like this. And then, of course, he caved in. And he made that Faustian bargain. He basically said, I have to work with a guy. And in a Faustian bargain, you get a lot of things you want. This is the thing people need to understand. You get the gold and the beautiful women and all that stuff. And then you find out what the price tag is. And the price tag is way higher than you think it is. So he starts off by, I can appease him, or I can be the guy in the room. As long as I'm in the room, I can stop bad things from happening. And so the rationalization continues, but you have to swallow more and more. As you slice off one bit of your soul after another, I suppose it becomes easier after a while. But that's part of the tragedy, is that we could have gone in one direction, and yet Republicans chose to go in a completely different direction. And in part, it's because not enough people stood up and said no, because they didn't want to become what they didn't want to become Liz Cheney, or they didn't want to become Adam Kinzinger. Right. And I live in a moral universe where I'd way rather be Adam Kinzinger and Liz Cheney than Marco Rubio right now.
Right.
Seriously.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Or Lindsey Graham.
Right. Oh my gosh. So I love that you quoted from the Second Coming, because that's what when you said the center will not, has not held. It's like, that's what I see happening now, and we're applying it so far to the conservative movement, to the Republican Party. How the best lack all conviction, and the worst are filled with passionate intensity. This is also what I'm seeing in the church, and this is more like the specific area that I'm working in here is basically trying to make these same arguments about the Faustian bargain that you just talked about. Mm-hmm. The church has done that, the church writ large. And by the church, I could mean the evangelical movement, white evangelical movement, or any conservative Christians. Mm-hmm. And so I just really appreciated, and this is why I reached out to you, I really appreciated the article that you wrote the other day called Donald Trump's War on Christianity. And I liked the way you framed it up. And do you want to talk a little bit about what you were thinking when you wrote that, what you were seeing?
Well, he has wrapped himself in Christian identity and Christian nationalism. But what is the content of Christianity? And I mean, I remember back in 2015, 2016, when he was at a meeting of evangelicals, and he was asked, do you ever ask for God's forgiveness? And Donald Trump very clearly said, no, I never do. God doesn't come into it. This, by the way, should have been a tip off for folks, but we know the rest. And every time that he actually encounters a Christian call for mercy or compassion, or Christian acts of charity, he pushes back or tries to destroy them. And it's again and again and again, whether it is the bishop in Washington who delivered the sermon, who, said, please show mercy to people. And he attacked her on social media and ripped her. Or these cuts that Elon Musk is is doing with his chainsaw
Hmm.
are decimating Christian charities around the world. I mean, including the charities run by evangelical supporters of Donald Trump, who for years have tried to live out the gospel, and yet they're being slashed. And there's a little bit of cognitive dissonance because they're thinking, wait, we thought you were our ally, that you supported what we were doing. But when it comes to actual kindness and actual compassion, no. And so there's always that tension. And especially as you watch Donald Trump dismantling this vast infrastructure. And this is something, by the way, that conservatives used to believe in, this vast infrastructure of civil society,
Mm.
of little platoons of people, churches and communities that show love for one another and compassion for one another. And in Donald Trump's world, which celebrates strength and cruelty and exclusion, there's no place for this. So how do
Right.
you reconcile Donald Trump's actual relationship with Christian values with his embrace of it? And part of it's the fact that for a lot of people, apparently Christianity has now become just your identity, your
Hmm.
tribal affiliation, rather than the content of the gospel or of what churches claimed they believed in.
Right. Yeah, I think that's true. That's sadly true. Um, the reason I do this work is because while I know that that's true about a lot of people, that for a
Mm-hmm.
lot of people their faith is a tribal marker, or it's
Yeah.
boiled down to a couple of cultural issues that they've been told
Right.
these are the most important things.
Right.
Um, but I believe, and you can tell me if you think I'm a dreamer, but I believe that the only way America gets better is if uh, the actual Christians in America wake up again from this fever dream. I think that they've been used, they've been manipulated, and so my whole everything I'm doing is trying to find a way to wake people up. There's a song that Sting wrote years ago called "All This Time," where he says it's about two priests talking, and one of them says they go crazy in congregations, they only get better one by one. And so my thing is, like, I'm not trying to through my arguments to win a whole bunch of people over. I'm trying to equip people with things that when they're talking to their family members or talking to their friends, and
Yes, exactly.
so one of the things that I hear all the time is uh, but it's his policies. It's not his character, it's his policies. And the point that I've been making all along is it's the policies I have a problem with. You know, lying as a strategy is a policy. I mean, the undermining the rule of law is a policy. It's a strategy. It's grounded in a defective character, but it's a policy. And so I just want to have you talk for a moment about this. If you've paid attention to the most recent example that you would probably put in the article if you wrote it today
Mm-hmm.
of things is this shutting off of the program that's tracking 30,000
Oh my God.
Ukrainian
Yeah.
children who've been stolen. And so that's been apparently shut off.
Yes.
And here's the encouraging part, Charlie, is that I read about it. I mean, I heard about it sooner than this, but I read about it on Fox News website, and Fox News has a straight up story about this.
Yeah. Yeah,
And
they do.
I think some of these things have the power to cut through. There's certain policies that I think do have the power to cut through some of that, media. But what do you think?
No, I agree with you completely, and I also agree with on the one-on-one. And I think this is part of our challenge is to not expect people to change their values, but to appeal to their values. And one of the things I've noticed is that when you separate out just the top line, like do you support Trump or not support Trump, most people still have a fundamental decency and compassion in their daily lives. They raise their children in a certain way. They look for their family members and their coworkers to behave in a certain way. And if you identify those values, like for example, do we abandon kidnapped children? How does
Right.
this relate? And I also think that your point about the character and policy is crucial because Donald Trump's character is so much part of his persona.
Right.
And as a result, you can just sort of sense there's this penumbra of maliciousness that goes out from it, that we no longer hold people to even basic standards of decency, the way they treat women, telling truth, all of these things. And you see this in the people he surrounds himself with and what is considered to be acceptable. It is a poisoning of the culture. That it used to be that politics is downstream from culture. Well, it's also true right now that culture is downstream from politics. And when we find things that are acceptable and we look the other way about law breaking and cruelty and brutality and insults, all of those things will trickle down into our culture in a deep way. This is something that I think that the churches once understood fundamentally. Mm-hmm. So I do think that's important. And I do think that there are these very, very important voices. Two of my best friends who try to explain this to me and have tried to explain this to me over the last 8 years, David French and Peter Wehner. Peter Wehner writes for The Atlantic. David French writes for the New York Times right now. Russell Moore, who is the editor of Christianity Today, has courageously been holding firm against the tsunami that's hit evangelical Christians. And I think what they all understand is start with these fundamental values and then say, if you believe this, how can you accept this? Right. And to the extent that there is hope, it is going to be changing those hearts and minds one-on-one and encouraging people to say, what's more important, that I stay part of this tribe or that I live consistently with the values that I think define who I am? And that sounds easy, but I think what we're discovering now is how difficult it is.
Right.
And that we've taken a lot of things for granted, but it now takes courage to do that.
Right, exactly. And the one thing that keeps me going, I think I have hope for that this sort of thing can happen because it's conversations like this, And so I just appreciate this, and I want to just, I want to wrap up here because I know you've got another thing, but one thing I'll say that I just so appreciate about you is your curiosity. I have a friend named Ned who'll be thrilled to hear you talking. He was my mentor in ministry, and he's still, one of my best friends. And that's what you remind me of, is this curiosity where you're always asking questions. And that curiosity, I think, has like opened up a world for a lot of people who just listen to your conversations on your podcast, because you're always digging. And I just want you to know, here's a guy in St. Paul who now I'm doing this full time starting about a week from now, and it's because of your influence. And
thank you. That's wonderful.
Yeah, so I just want to thank you for that. And with that, I'm just going to wrap it up and say thank you, Charlie Sykes, for spending this time with us. I really appreciate it.
Well, I really enjoyed the conversation, and thank you for the invitation.
All right, thank you.